Picture this. A boy, no older than 10, dragged from his home at sunrise, his mother screaming, a soldier's hand on his shoulder. And somewhere far away, in the shadowed halls of a palace, a blade is already being heated in fire, waiting for him. A Venetian trader returned from Constantinople with a story he could never silence. In the bustling markets of Venice, he spoke of silks, spices, and gold. Yet in his private notes, he described something else, something darker. He had seen boys, children barely taller than the swords carried by their captors, taken into the depths of the Ottoman palaces. What happened to them there was not discipline, nor punishment. It was a ritual of transformation, designed to erase who they had been and reshape them into something the empire called flawless servants. These were not orphans or criminals. They were sons torn from households that had no power to resist. Behind closed doors, they were remade through methods so calculated, so cruel, that even centuries later the very descriptions feel unbearable. And what the merchant wrote was only the beginning. Diplomatic archives, medical notes, even the rare testimony of those who lived through it, reveal a machinery of control that spanned generations. The Ottomans gave this system a name: the devshirme, the harvest of children. Imagine a village at dawn, the smoke from cooking fires barely rising when the sound of hooves breaks the morning quiet. Ottoman officials ride in with soldiers at their side, not searching for thieves or rebels, but for children. The ritual had a name that sounded almost harmless in their language: devshirme, the gathering. But for the families who faced it, it was the tearing out of their future. Boys still clinging to their mother's clothes, boys who had just learned to herd goats or carry water, were measured with cold eyes, strong shoulders, quick minds, unblemished faces. Parents tried everything. Some scarred their sons' skin with knives, hoping to make them less desirable. Others broke their children's fingers in desperation. It rarely mattered. The soldiers had quotas to fill. Once chosen, the boys were chained together like links in a human chain. 100 at a time they were marched away. Behind them rose a wall of screams, mothers crying out names that would never be answered again. The march itself was another test. Dust and hunger thinned the line every day. Disease spread through the children like fire through dry grass. Some collapsed and never rose again. Others, unable to face what lay ahead, threw themselves against rocks or into rivers. Ottoman records note these losses with chilling detachment. 1 in every 3, gone before reaching the capital. For those who survived, Constantinople was no salvation. It was the gateway into something far worse. Buildings that looked like schools from the outside, but functioned as factories of obedience inside. The Ottomans called them preparation houses. From the outside, the so-called preparation houses looked like ordinary training schools. High walls, guarded gates, tiled roofs. But once the heavy doors closed, every illusion of safety vanished. The boys were not greeted with lessons or food. They were locked in bare cells, waiting. For days they were left in silence, except for the sounds that filtered through the walls. Muffled cries, then sharp screams, then nothing. The waiting was deliberate. It was the first step in teaching fear. When their turn came, they were dragged down narrow staircases into underground rooms the Ottomans called purification chambers. The air was thick with the stench of blood and smoke. On stone tables, children were held down while a barber surgeon pressed a blade, heated red in fire, against their bodies. There was no relief, no mercy. Leather straps were shoved between their teeth so they would not bite off their own tongues in agony. Some endured partial mutilation. Others lost everything. The difference was not compassion, but assignment, whether the empire intended them as guards, scribes, or attendants to the Sultan's household. The wounds were seared with hot irons, not to heal but simply to keep them alive a little longer. Survivors were buried waist-deep in sand or salt, left without water for days. Many begged for death. Guards were ordered not to listen. 9 out of 10 never left those chambers alive. Their bodies were carted away at night, heaped into unmarked pits outside the city walls. For the empire, this was not tragedy. It was calculation. The weak would die, the broken would serve. And for the few who survived, the ordeal was not the end. It was only the beginning of a new design, to erase their past and rebuild them into instruments of obedience. For those who endured the knife and the fire, survival did not mean freedom. It meant entering the next stage, a campaign not against their bodies, but against their very sense of self. The first step was identity. The boys were stripped of their birth names. In their place came new words, Turkish or Arabic, forced upon them until even a whisper of their true names brought punishment. Some forgot within months. Others clung to memory in silence, carrying their lost names like secret wounds. Language was the next target. Their native tongues, Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian, Armenian, were outlawed. Guards moved silently among them, listening. A single word spoken in the wrong language could mean days without food. Hunger became the whip that trained them. And then came the lies. Some were told their parents had willingly given them up. Others that their families were dead, their villages burned. There was no way to know the truth. Cut off from every tie of home, the children began to doubt even their own memories. Discipline followed a rhythm of cruelty. They were forced to stand motionless for hours until their legs buckled. When they collapsed, they were beaten back onto their feet. They learned to remain still, to make themselves invisible, to read the smallest flicker of an overseer's eyes and anticipate every command before it was spoken. Questions were not allowed. Curiosity brought humiliation, mockery, beatings, or confinement in lightless cells. Each correction cut deeper than the last, carving away at independence until nothing remained but reflexive obedience. The boys learned hunger, stillness, silence. They learned to live without trust, without hope. And slowly, the past, their homes, their families, their own voices, began to fade like dreams half remembered at dawn. What remained was something the Empire considered useful. Children remade into shadows of themselves, pliable, watchful, already half-machine. Once the boys had been emptied of who they were, the Empire began the work of filling that void. This stage was not about scars on the flesh. It was about bending the soul until it no longer resisted. Daily life became a theatre of control. The children were woken before dawn and forced into punishing routines that had no purpose, except to remind them that every breath belonged to someone else. Hours of stillness, endless drills of meaningless tasks. The point was not skill, it was surrender. Hunger was a constant companion. Meals were meager, designed to leave them desperate. And sometimes, when a boy showed unusual obedience, he might be given an extra scrap of bread, a cup of water. These small mercies were calculated. Gratitude was twisted into dependency, until the children began to see their captors as both tormentors and saviors. Occasionally, the overseers softened their voices or allowed a fleeting kindness, a hand on the shoulder, a word of approval. The effect was devastating. Boys who had once dreamed of escape began to crave those moments of recognition. They started to compete for approval, to report each other's mistakes, to enforce rules against their own companions. The Empire's design was working. In the span of months, tears dried. In the span of years, memories dimmed. Some stopped asking about their parents altogether, not because they had forgotten, but because the questions no longer felt real. The children were no longer children. They were becoming tools, fragile enough to be controlled, yet durable enough to serve. The reshaping was nearly complete. When the reshaping was done, the boys were sorted like merchandise at a market. Their futures, if they could be called futures, were decided by traits they had never chosen. The most striking in appearance were singled out for proximity to power. These boys became attendants in the palaces of high officials or the Sultan himself. Beauty, which might once have brought them admiration in their villages, now marked them for constant danger. Behind the silk curtains of the imperial household, they lived in fear, never knowing when a glance would turn into exploitation. Those who showed intelligence were assigned to the empire's bureaucracy. They spent long days in dim rooms, bent over ledgers and scrolls, their minds reduced to tools for record-keeping. Whatever spark of brilliance they once carried was redirected into serving the machine that had broken them. The physically strong were given weapons and turned into guards. To them was handed a cruel irony: authority over other servants. They patrolled corridors and training yards, enforcing the same brutal discipline that had once been inflicted upon them. Each blow they struck against another boy echoed with the memory of their own suffering. Regardless of category, all lived under relentless scrutiny. Dormitories were built without shadows, their beds lined in perfect rows so that every movement could be watched. Privacy was forbidden. Friendship was dangerous. Even the smallest gesture of affection risked punishment. In every role, the message was the same: they did not belong to themselves. Their beauty, their intellect, their strength, all were claimed by the Empire. They had been transformed from children into instruments, stripped of choice, bound to lives they could never escape. No matter what role the Empire assigned them, the boys carried the same invisible shackles: surveillance that never ended. They slept in long halls where the beds stood shoulder to shoulder, watched even in their dreams. Walls and ceilings were bare, designed so that no dark corner could hide a whisper or a secret. The light of lanterns lingered through the night, not to comfort but to expose. Meals were taken in silence. The boys ate apart, each one forced into solitude, even when surrounded by others. To speak too long, to lean too close, was to risk suspicion. Bonds of friendship, which might have offered a flicker of humanity, were treated as threats to loyalty. The lesson was constant. No part of them was private. Their footsteps, their glances, even their breaths seemed monitored. It was as if the Empire sought to erase not only their families and their pasts, but also the possibility of ever belonging to anyone but the Sultan. And over time, this isolation sank deep. Many forgot how to laugh, how to trust, how to share a thought without fear. The silence was not just enforced from outside, it began to live inside them. They had become shadows, moving through corridors of stone, present, obedient, but hollow. For the few who lived long enough to grow into men, survival did not mean escape. Their bodies carried the marks of what had been done to them. Many remained small, their voices never deepening, their health fragile. Illness stalked them early, and death often came decades before its time. But the deeper wounds were harder to see. Nights brought no rest. Survivors woke drenched in sweat, chased by dreams of the chambers where they had first been broken. Some never spoke of their memories, not because they had healed, but because words could not contain the weight of what they had seen. A sense of exile clung to them even in crowded rooms. They belonged nowhere, not to the villages that had lost them, not to the empire that had used them. Relationships were rare, and when they formed, they carried the shadow of mistrust. Love, for many, was something they had learned to fear. Some turned their pain outward, repeating the cycle as guards or overseers themselves. Others withdrew entirely, moving through life as if half present, their minds elsewhere, their hearts locked away. The loneliness was profound, an emptiness that no position, no title could ever fill. To live after such a system was not to live freely. It was to carry an invisible prison inside, one that no gate or decree could ever unlock. What makes this story even more harrowing is not just what happened to a few villages, or a handful of children, but the sheer span of time. This was not a passing cruelty. It was a system, carefully maintained, repeated again and again for generations. Over the course of nearly 400 years, wave after wave of boys were taken. Historians estimate their number in the hundreds of thousands. Whole regions of the Balkans and Anatolia lived with the constant dread of the next collection, never knowing which families would be left without sons when the soldiers departed. The practice did not disappear quickly. Even as Europe marched toward modernity, printing presses, gunpowder, new ideas of freedom, the machinery of the devshirme continued. It survived revolts, wars, treaties. It endured until the very beginning of the 20th century, when political pressure and international scrutiny finally forced the empire to let it collapse. By then, it had shaped countless lives, and its echoes stretched far beyond the palaces of Constantinople. Generations had grown up with the knowledge that their ancestors had been stolen, reshaped, erased. Some carried family stories of sons who never returned. Others had only silence, a gap in the lineage that could never be explained. The longevity of the system is its own kind of horror. Not a single tyrant's whim, not a single decade of madness, but a tradition, embedded and normalized, that outlived empires and altered the fabric of entire peoples. For a long time, the Devshirme lived mainly in chronicles and memories, a brutal story folded into the past. But in recent years, the earth itself has begun to speak. Archaeologists digging near the ruins of former training houses have uncovered pits filled with small bones. No markers, no names, just shallow graves where the dead were discarded without ceremony. Many of the skeletons bore unmistakable signs of violence. Infections left untreated, bones shattered, skulls with crude surgical cuts. Soil samples added another layer of unease. Traces of early chemical compounds, substances that may have been used to dull pain or test the effects of mind-altering plants, suggest experiments carried out on living children. Records from the empire remain silent on these practices. The silence itself feels deliberate, as if pages had been torn away. Each discovery has raised more questions than it answers. Were these deaths part of routine brutality, or evidence of hidden medical trials? How many stories were erased before they could ever be told? The graves are mute, but the message is clear. The Devshirme was not only a system of service, but also one of disposal. The children were resources, measured in their usefulness, and when they broke, they were cast aside. Even now, centuries later, the soil carries the weight of those voices that were never heard. And with every excavation, the past grows harder to ignore. Today, the Devshirme is remembered as one of history's quieter atrocities, overshadowed by wars and empires, yet no less devastating in its reach. Its legacy does not lie only in archives or graves, but in the invisible fractures it left behind. Families with missing branches, cultures haunted by silence where stories should have been. The system was designed with precision, but its true cruelty was not just in the violence of blades or chains. It was in the slow erasure of identity, in the transformation of children into tools. It showed how an empire could build power not only through armies and conquests, but through the systematic breaking of human beings. What lingers is the lesson that such power is never stable. The Ottomans believed they were shaping perfect servants. In reality, they were revealing the darkest truth of domination, that control gained through fear and suffering leaves scars that outlast any empire. To look back at the Devshirme is to confront more than history. It is to acknowledge how easily cruelty can be normalized, how an entire system can operate in plain sight, generation after generation, without collapsing under its own horror. The monuments of that empire may crumble, its palaces may turn to ruins, but the memory of the children, nameless and countless, remains, not as statistics, but as reminders of what happens when humanity is treated as raw material. And in that sense, the Devshirme still speaks, not only of the past, but as a warning to every age that believes cruelty can ever be justified as order.